Welcome again, everyone. It's great to see you. And welcome to our guests who have dropped in as well. We're continuing our series on the roots of secular humanistic Judaism. We've previously talked about Yiddishists and the concept of Doikite, improving Jewish life where it was in the language Jews were already speaking in Eastern Europe. We talked about Zionists who envisioned a secular Jewish state with creative secular Jewish culture in Hebrew in the land of Israel. And we've also talked about the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, the early Reform movement, and also Reconstructionist Judaism as other examples of creative responses to Jewish life, and in some ways interesting precursors to us because they also tried to create non-halakha, non-Jewish law-based communities, often in the vernacular language and with a creative response to what it meant to be Jewish, expecting Judaism to either be only a religion, a la Reform Judaism in its classical period, or primarily a culture and civilization in Reconstructionism, which is also how we approach the sense of our identity. Today, we're going to be talking about two different kinds of roots that are in some ways in opposite directions because they have one part of who we are, but not necessarily both. So the first kind of people we're going to talk about are people who were secular. They might even have self-identified as humanists, but they weren't Jewish. And then the other kind of people are going to be Jews who were secular, but who may not have identified as secular humanistic Jews. And these are sort of the famous names that we sometimes like to name drop of people who, well, they would have agreed with us if only they'd known we existed, which may or may not be true. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So let's start first with this concept of people who were secular or even humanists, but were not Jewish as a possible source for us. Often when people think about Jewish history, they imagine that Jewish history ran as a bubble, that there were no influences from the outside world, that Jews studied only in Hebrew, they only studied with other Jews, they didn't learn from the surrounding cultures. So one example is a passage that appears in the Talmud. This is in the section called Bava Kama, page 82b, which means the 82nd sheet on the B side, the second side. The Mishnah in earlier teaching says, one may not raise pigs anywhere. The sages taught some background to this. When the members of the house of the Hasmonean monarchy were at war with each other, you may remember Hasmoneans or the Maccabees. When the Maccabee house was at war with each other, Hyrcanus, one of the side of the parties, was inside Jerusalem that was besieged, while his brother Aristobulus, the other contender to the throne, was on the outside. And every day the people would lower down money in a box from the temple walls to purchase sheep to sacrifice. And those on the other side would take the money up and send the sheep over to them for the wall for the daily offerings. So look at what's happening here. You have Jews inside Jerusalem being besieged by Jews outside of Jerusalem, but the ones inside need sheep to offer at the temple for sacrifices. So they send down money to the people outside who then send up a sheep to continue the sacrifices. So even though they're fighting, they're still maintaining the ritual practice. You might notice, though, we're talking about hermetically sealed life. Notice the names of these Jewish leaders, Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. Don't sound particularly Jewish, do they? There was a certain elder who was familiar with Greek wisdom, and he said to those besieging Jerusalem, as long as they occupy themselves with the temple service, they will not be delivered into your hands. The next day they lowered down money in a box as usual, but this time they sent up to them a pig, massively not kosher. When the pig reached the midpoint of the temple wall, it stuck its hooves into the wall, and Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, trembled over an area of 400 parsangs by 400 parsangs, a huge distance. And at that time, at that very hour, the sages said, cursed be the man who raises pigs, and cursed be the man who teaches his son Greek wisdom. So what you hear out of that story is the sense that Greek wisdom is polluting. It disrupts the ritual practice that should be happening normally. It involves unkosher animals, defiling what should be holy. I'll point out it's also clever. You know, there's something to be said for when you have a siege going, not giving them a sheep every day, because after they offer the sacrifices, they get to use what's left of the animal. So there's a practical side to that wisdom too. But in actual fact, you can see, whether it's by the names or by other discussions, I'll talk about it in a moment, Jewish life was never in a bubble that was never influenced by outside peoples. It was always a process of interchange and dialogue with the outside culture. You notice the names, Hyrcanos, Aristobulus. Even when you think about Passover, the last piece of food that you're supposed to eat at the Seder is a piece of matzah called the afikomen. And afikomen comes directly from a Greek word, epikomenos, which means what you eat after the meal. In other words, dessert. Another example is the very word for heretic in Rabbinic Hebrew is Epicurus. And we'll see an example of the Greek philosopher Epicurus, who gave his name to Hebrew as a loan word for heretic. And in fact, from a Jewish religious point of view, Epicurus's ideas were dangerous and heretical. We might actually find them very attractive. We've also found plenty of ideas in Jewish life that find their way in from other cultures. There are new studies being done even now of the Babylonian Talmud in the light of both Greek philosophic dialogic logic and Sasanian religious thought that's happening in the cultures around them. All of these had an influence on how the Talmudic argument happened. We think of Talmudic argument as particularly Jewish, but it was Jewish as it evolved in response to surrounding cultures. What made it Jewish was Jews were doing it. Or one other example I learned about a few years ago. In rabbinic thought around the Middle Ages, like 1200 of the Common Era, there began to be this idea that after someone died, you should recite the Kaddish for them, the prayer for the dead, for them regularly as a way of lessening the sins that they were working off in the limbo zone of Gehenna before they were able to make their way into Gan Eden, into the paradise that was envisioned afterwards. So first of all, this for some people is news to realize that Jews actually did believe in an afterlife at one time, which many of them did and many of them still do. It's all over traditional Orthodox liturgy and practice. But it also is interesting to think about Jews in this kind of hell purgatory zone where they're burning off sins and you're reciting prayers to help ease their way. It turns out this is happening in Europe at the same times and places that the Catholic Church came up with the idea of selling indulgences. You may recall this is one of the things that drove Martin Luther to break with the church because it was corrupting. The idea was you could buy your relative's way out of hell by making donations to the church. It's one of the ways they built St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City is through selling indulgences. So it was a tremendously corrupting thing. But it's fascinating that Jews are developing a similar concept of post-mortem intervention by the living to deal with sins of the dead. At the same time, Christians are doing the same process. So there's clearly some intellectual give and take going on in European society. So it's very reasonable. And in fact, it's part of a Jewish tradition, evidently. If secular humanistic Judaism today has sources beyond secular or secularized Jewish people, we might read examples from Epicurus through the secular revolutions of science and knowledge in the 18th and 19th century, to thinkers of secular ethics like Kant or John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. We might find these are very articulate expressors of our belief system and add to our sense of what it means to be a good person or to understand the world. So I want to give you just a couple examples of this. I'm going to share with you a piece from Epicurus himself. This is from the letter to Menicius. And Epicurus is a really fascinating philosopher. He says that he believed in the gods, but not the gods worshipped by the multitude. Epicurus's concept of gods was that if there were gods, then they had nothing to do with human beings, because if they're immortal and perfectly happy, why would their happiness depend on you offering sacrifices or misbehaving? That seems totally ungodly. If they're truly perfect, they have really nothing to do with people, so don't worry about them. They don't care. And a lot of people became attached to religion because they were worried about what happened after they died. And here's what he says in the third paragraph of this letter. Accustom yourself to believe that death is nothing to us, for good and evil imply awareness, and death is the privation of all awareness. Therefore, a right understanding that death is nothing to us makes the mortality of life enjoyable, not by adding to life an unlimited time, but by taking away the yearning after immortality. For life has no terror. For those who thoroughly apprehend there are no terrors for them in ceasing to live. Foolish, therefore, is the person who says he fears death, not because it will pain when it comes, but because it pains in the prospect. Jumping forward a little bit. Death, therefore, the most awful of evils, is nothing to us, seeing that when we are, death has not come. And when death has come, we are not. It is nothing then either to the living or to the dead, for with the living it is not, and the dead exist no longer. Why be afraid of death? Once you are no longer, it's like you never were. You didn't know about your life before you existed, and you won't know a lot about your life when you die. In fact, Epicurus came up with an idea that we were all made up of little atoms. And after we died, the atoms dispersed, and so there was no us anymore after we were dead. That was the end. So why be afraid of death? Live your life here and now. Enjoy life. In fact, you may have heard, if you have a good SAT vocabulary, the word epicure, that someone is an epicure. It often has the connotation of a glutton or someone who is very into fancy food. In fact, that was the opposite of Epicurus himself, because yes, he said you should enjoy life in this life and seek pleasure, but he also said it's a lot easier to satisfy simple pleasures. So if you reduce your desires to just liking a good loaf of bread, a good bottle of wine, and good friendship, you will easily satisfy all your desires. If you get a taste for foie gras and they run out of foie gras, now you're in trouble. So it's a really interesting aesthetic, kind of minimalist kind of lifestyle, very attractive in a modern secular key. And so there's a reason why Epicurus was not only the bugaboo for the rabbinic establishment to make the word for heretic Epicurus, but it was also evidently attractive to enough Jews that they might have followed his ideas enough that the rabbis made it an epithet. I'll give you another example of some of the true radicals that were involved in this developing concept of humanist philosophy starting in the late 18th century. One example, one of my favorites, is a Scottish philosopher named David Hume. David Hume wrote a book called Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, which he published posthumously. And if you ever read it, you'll realize why he published it posthumously. Because if he'd published it when he was alive, he shortly would have been posthumous. He's very, very radical in the kind of things he says in this dialogue. And again, he tries to have a cover for it by claiming it's just characters in a dialogue exploring ideas. But he's the writer, so obviously he's agreeing with the most powerful arguments. And so one of the arguments is, how do you know that there's just one God and that your God is perfect? So let's say you claim that this world shows the signs of a creator God. This later takes on the idea of a watch by a man named William Paley after Hume comes up with this idea that if you're walking on the beach and you find a watch, the watch just didn't happen by accident. There had to be a watchmaker that made that watch. There's no way all those pieces fit together so perfectly. And so, said Paley, or said other people that Hume was responding to, the world works so perfectly, obviously there must have been a world maker that made it function the way it does. And Hume's response is, the irony and the sort of subtle humor in it is delicious. So he says, for example, well, every example of a technology that I've seen went through several drafts and trials. You know, you don't just build a ship with rigging and sealing instantly. You try it out and it works. It doesn't work. You try it for many generations. So what version of the world are we? Are we version 3.0, 3.5, 3.5.2? Like, how many trials and errors have there been here? Also, that doesn't prove that there's one world maker, because every ship I've ever seen has one person who works on the rigging and one person who works on the instruments and one person who makes sure it's sealed and one person who provides the food. Why would you assume that it's all one maker? In fact, given the way the world works, it might well have been made by committee. And third, you don't have to be perfect to make things. Maybe this world was made by an infant God that didn't quite know what it was doing, and that's why it doesn't work so well. Or maybe it was made by a really old God that was sort of past its prime and didn't really know what it was doing, and then it died and the world just kept on running on without him. You can see why he published this after he was dead. But you can also see why the kind of questions he's asking about a perfect God who knows everything, who does everything, are the same kind of questions that we asked in the first half of this class. We were talking about these basic philosophical questions of the world and humanity, and is there or not a God that intervenes in the world? I'll give you one other example of one of my favorites. He's actually not quite a native son of Illinois. He was born in upstate New York, and then his family moved to Illinois, but he became famous here. His name was Robert Ingersoll. At one time, he was the Attorney General of Illinois. He was thought of as a potential candidate for governor because he was such a great orator. And he had been a Civil War veteran, so he had that going for him. But they asked him to maybe, he didn't have to go to church, but just tone down his atheism. And he said, no way. He refused. And that was sort of the end of his political career, but he made a career on the stump, speaking at Chautauquas and major public events and so on. And so I want to share with you some of his sort of best of sayings, because again, the rhetoric is really, really wonderful. So here are some selections from Robert Ingersoll. We have heard talk enough. We've listened to all the drowsy, idealist, vapid sermons we wish to hear. We have read your Bible and the works of your best minds. We have heard your prayers, your solemn groans, your reverential amens. All these amount to less than nothing. We want one fact. We beg at the door of your churches for just one fact. We pass our hats along your pews and under your pulpits and implore you for just one fact. We know all about your moldy wonders and your stale miracles. We want this year a fact. We ask only one. Give us one fact for charity. Your miracles are too ancient. The witnesses have been dead for nearly 2,000 years. This is another nice paragraph where he compares the benefits of theology and science, where when the theologian governed, life was terrible, science dawned, and men in the middle ranks of life now have more of the convenience and elegancies than the princes and kings of theological time. There is more of value in the brain of an average man of today than there was in the brain of the world 400 years ago. And these blessings did not fall from the skies or come from the hands of priests or were found in cathedrals. They are the children of freedom, the gifts of reason, observation, and experience. Another nice one. If with all the time at my disposal, with all the wealth of the resources of this vast universe, to do with as I will, I could not produce a better scheme of life than now prevails, I would be ashamed of my efforts and consider my work a humiliating failure. You see, the weakness of the William Paleys of the world who say the world is so perfect is there are plenty of times the world is not perfect. You know, childhood diseases, cancers, earthquakes, floods. There are plenty of ways it could be better. I love this next one. The clergy know that I know that they do not know. I admit that reason is a small and feeble flame, a flickering torch by stumblers carried in the starless night, blown and flared by passion's storm, and yet it is the only light. Extinguish that and naught remains. And another nice line, one line. The labor is the only prayer that nature answers, the only prayer that deserves an answer. Good, honest, noble work. And then the last one I want to read to you because we actually use it in our congregation with some gender adaptation as a piece of inspirational liturgy at one of our high holiday services. For thousands of years, men have been writing the real Bible, and it is being written from day to day and will never be finished while man has life. All the facts that we know, all the truly recorded events, all the discoveries and inventions, all the wonderful machines whose wheels and levers seem to think, all the poems, crystals from the brain, flowers from the heart, all the songs of love and joy, of smiles and tears, the great dramas of imagination's world, the wondrous paintings, miracles of form and color, of light and shade, the marvelous marbles that seem to live and breathe, the secrets told by rock and star, by dust and flower, by rain and snow, frost and flame, by winding stream and desert sand, by mountain range and billowed sea. All the wisdom that lengthens and ennobles life, all that avoids or cures disease or conquers pain, all just and perfect laws and rules that guide and shape our lives, all thoughts that feed the flames of love, the music that transfigures and raptures and enthralls, the victories of heart and brain, the miracles that hands have wrought, the deft and cunning hands of those who worked for wife and child, the history of noble deeds of brave and useful men, of faithful loving wives, well, we skipped that gender stuff, of quenchless mother love, of conflicts for the right, of sufferings for the truth, of all the best that all the men and women of the world have said and thought and done through all the years. These treasures of the heart and brain, these are the sacred scriptures of the human race. That's inspiring. That's exciting. He's not Jewish at all. But it's moving. You know, there's wonderful poetry by Mary Oliver and by Emily Dickinson and other poets that speak to us, that move us emotionally. And so if the only source of our ideas were Jewish sources, if our only roots were people from our biological family tree, then we couldn't draw on these sources, and it would be inaccurate because we've read them. They inspire us. They make us think differently. They make us act differently. And so I find it very important in talking about the roots of secular humanistic Judaism to draw on these outside sources. Just like when I talked about Reconstructionism, I mentioned that Mordecai Kaplan had studied John Dewey, and John Dewey had actually come up with the idea of Reconstruction in religion. You need to acknowledge your sources. Maimonides learned from Aristotle. Philo of the first century of the Common Era learned from Plato. Jews learned from outside sources through all of our history. And I think it's both reasonable and right for us to acknowledge that part of our intellectual inheritance. So that's a quick overview of that first category of our roots we're talking about today, the people who were secular but not necessarily Jewish, but still provide ideas and inspiration. And there are many other thinkers in this category, poets and literary authors and so on. It's not limited to the people I mentioned, but I think it's useful to draw on those as well when we're looking for inspirational sources for our movement's approach. So let's move on then to think about the other side of it. Jews who've been secularized, who may have existed before our movement existed, or maybe existed contemporaneous with it, but never formally affiliated with it. There are a lot of outside influences in Jewish culture, as we saw, and Jewish culture historically has been a very literate culture, and usually literate in non-Jewish languages, not only in the Hebrew letter alphabet and languages that used it like Yiddish or Ladino. So if we were deeply literate in the surrounding culture, and the surrounding culture is interesting and attractive, and we've had influences by it, of course, we are not the first Jews ever to be secularized. Ever since there was Epicurus, there have been Epicurusim. There have been Jews attracted by that outside philosophy. So I'm going to share with you a short passage that talks about one of them by a modern writer that opens up this question. His name is Isaac Deutscher. We're actually going to change files here. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I got to change pages in this file. So let's go to page 38. Oh, next page. And 39, Isaac Deutscher. Here we go. He wrote a book, but this is a selection from that book, called The Non-Jewish Jew. There's an old Talmudic saying, a Jew who has sinned still remains a Jew. My thinking is beyond the idea of sin or no sin, but it reminds me of a memory from childhood. I remember a story I read about Rabbi Meir, the great saint and sage who took lessons in theology from a heretic, Elisha ben Avuya, also known as Acher, the stranger. He's like the quintessential Epicurus of the early rabbinic period. Once on a Sabbath, Rabbi Meir was with his teacher, and they became engaged in a deep argument. The heretic was riding a donkey, and Meir, as he could not ride on the Sabbath, walked by his side and listened so intently to the words of wisdom falling from his heretical lips that he failed to notice he and his teacher reached the ritual boundary which Jews were not allowed to cross on Shabbat, on the Sabbath. The heretic turned to his traditional pupil and said, "You must separate from me now, go back." So Meir went back to the Jewish community, and the heretic rode on beyond the boundaries of Jewry. And Deutscher wonders, why did this leading light of orthodoxy take lessons from the heretic? And maybe the heretic himself is in Jewry and yet out of it. You see that passage here in the middle on the right. He showed a curious respect for his pupil's orthodoxy, sending him back to the Jews, but he himself rode beyond the boundaries. And Deutscher said, that heretic sounds interesting and attractive, and maybe a model for me. In fact, he writes, the Jewish heretic who transcends Jewry belongs to a Jewish tradition. You may, if you like, see Acher as a prototype of those great revolutionaries of modern thought, Spinoza, Heine, Marx, Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky, and Freud. You may, if you wish to, place them within a Jewish tradition. They all went beyond the boundaries of Jewry. They all found Jewry too narrow, too archaic, and too constricting. They looked for ideals and fulfillment beyond it. And they represent the sum and substance of much that is greatest in modern thought. Interesting choices of names. Because of all of those, only Freud unambiguously said, I am Jewish, even though he knew he was also philosophically secular. You can read Freud's Future of an Illusion, and he very clearly does not believe in a personal, transcendent, supernatural God. No question. And he was also Jewish from the beginning to the end of his life as a member of B'nai B'rith and active in Jewish causes and so on. But the other names, Trotsky rejected his Jewishness. Luxemburg has an essay where she talks about, I don't care about your Jewish concerns, explicitly. Marx never identified as Jewish. In fact, his father had converted. Heine himself converted out of it. And Spinoza defined Jewishness as following Jewish law, which he felt he wasn't obligated to do, so he might not have identified as Jewish either. So what do they have in common? They don't self-identify as Jewish, but they're famous and of Jewish heritage. And they reflect an ideology. You can tell Deutscher is on the political left. He's not, an Ayn Rand devotee. You can tell by his heroes. But what it's doing here is highlighting them not only as radical thinkers, as brilliant thinkers, according to Deutscher, but also as breaking the mold. So here he explains further. Have they impressed mankind's thought so greatly because of their special Jewish genius? I do not believe in the exclusive genius of any race. And yet, I think in some ways they were very Jewish indeed. They were a priori exceptional in that as Jews, they dwelt on the borderlines of various civilizations, religions, and national cultures. They were born and brought up on the borderlines of epochs. Their minds matured when diverse cultural influences crossed and fertilized. They lived on the margins or in the nooks and crannies of their nations. Each was in society and yet not in it, of it and yet not of it. This enabled them to rise in thought above their societies and nations, to strike out mentally into wide new horizons far into the future. This is the idea of the Jew as the marginal genius, because they are raised, let's say like Freud in Viennese German culture, is fully fluent in that culture and yet also lives somewhat outside of it. Knows the vocabulary, but also is not fully a member of that community. And so by stepping outside of that one half step, he's able to see through the pieties and the vanities and the illusions that others accept and take for granted. So this is Deutscher's theory, that there's this concept of the non-Jewish Jew, the heretical Jew who's broken with the past and who has new ideas that itself becomes part of a Jewish tradition. Now, to be fair, there are plenty of people with radically new ideas who were not Jewish. And there are plenty of people who are Jewish who have totally conventional ideas. I'm sometimes reminded of this fact when you think about the stereotype of the 1960s with all these radicals at Woodstock. There were thousands and thousands of people who became accountants and dentists during the 1960s. Very conventional lives, okay? They might have had a beard in medical school. Maybe that was it. But the reality is that lots of Jews live conventional lives. They aren't on the margins and see themselves as breaking boundaries this way. And then you get an Einstein who sees relativity, and maybe it was because of his secularized Jewish background that he had a foot in both worlds and could see through the traditional paradigms in physics. It's one of those intellectual detective stories you're never really going to get a full answer to. And so there are episodic cases like this Elisha ben Avuya that Deutscher mentions. Or in the 9th century of the Common Era, there's a man named Chiwi al-Balchi, who evidently wrote a book of 100 criticisms of the Bible. We don't have Balchi's book, but we have the rebuttal to Balchi's book, written by Saadia Gaon, who was one of the major philosophical and religious leaders in the Jewish community in Baghdad in that same time period. So he writes about Balchi and says his heresy is terrible and I need to refute it all. And so he puts in all his, but by hearing the refutations, you can hear what Balki actually wrote. And he criticized things like, where did Cain find his wife? And how can you say God is good when he wipes out everybody in the flood? And again, similar kinds of questions to the ones we are asking. Now, where we have trouble is trying to claim that that's a tradition, because there was no school of Elisha ben Avuya that then created students that passed it on in the school of Elisha ben Avuya, that then founded the school of Chiwi al-Balchi, that then passed it down to the school of Spinoza. There's no transmission. It's episodic. It pops up here and there. Balch, in fact, was a multicultural caravan town. And often the multicultural caravan cities, like New York, like Paris, major cities, could be places of radical thought. Omar Khayyam also lives in one of these trading cities that has some flexibility for more skeptical, secularized thought. So they're episodic. It's hard to call it a tradition, but they're precursors. They blip up here and there, and we realize they're asking the same kind of questions that we ask today. And in the case of Ben Avuya, he maintained some kind of Jewish identity. We're not sure exactly what. And Chiwi al-Balchi, again, he's choosing to throw his stones at the Jewish tradition, so maybe that's itself a particular choice. There were even examples of Yiddish-speaking radicals in New York and in Eastern Europe in the 1920s and 30s who would make a point on Yom Kippur of having a ham sandwich and smoking a cigarette on the steps of the synagogue. The phrase in Yiddish is afsolochas. It means just to get you mad. I'm just going to do it in your face just because I can, just because you know that I'm not supposed to do it and I'm going to do it anyways. Bleh, take that. I had a friend who would intentionally gather sticks in his yard on the Sabbath because he knows it's explicitly prohibited in the Torah, and it would make his Orthodox neighbor annoyed. That's the afsolochas approach. So that dynamic, that personality is still around. But then we get other characters now who, in the process of secularization, became secularized Jews, but may never have heard of or may never have identified with our movement. You can think about people like Albert Einstein, Louis Brandeis, Sigmund Freud. By the way, all of them appear in our movement's anthology called Judaism in a Secular Age. Probably looks backward on your screen, but in that anthology, we have the founders of our movement, we have people who thought about Yiddishism and Zionism, and we have people like Einstein and Brandeis and Freud. Or you could take someone like, I don't know, Daniel Radcliffe today, who played Harry Potter in the Harry Potter movies. He's of Jewish background, he identifies as an atheist. Do we say, yay, he's one of us? Do we quote him on what it means to be Jewish, as if he's an expert? Well, it's nice to have Albert Einstein say something like, I don't believe in a personal God and I still value my Jewishness. His biography becomes somewhat of a role model for us, or inspirational, but quoting him on what it means to be Jewish, I don't know, I'd quote him on physics. I don't know how much he knows about what it means to be Jewish and if he's really going to provide insight and depth on that particular topic. This is the joke of the mansplainer who assumes that he knows more than a woman does on a particular topic, even if she's written a dissertation on the subject and he's read a Wikipedia article, but he still feels that he can say, well, actually, this is truly because he has particular insight. Well, I don't need to be Jew-splained or secular Jew-splained by Einstein. I have some knowledge in the field, and maybe he doesn't really know what he's talking about when he says the core idea of Judaism to me is blah. Okay, thanks, Albert. But maybe we can do some more research on that topic. So as another example of the complexities of this, our movement historically has focused on the role model idea. When the Birmingham Temple in Michigan came up with an alternative to a traditional Torah bar mitzvah, they focused on choosing a hero from the Jewish experience and doing a project based on their life as a role model figure. And likewise, several years ago, the Society for Humanistic Judaism started a program they called the Role Model of the Year. And the idea was we would choose someone from out of the Jewish experience who represented both Jewishness and a secular lifestyle. Guess who number one was? Bing! Albert Einstein. The next year we chose Sigmund Freud. The next year we chose Betty Friedan, who was both secular and still identified as Jewish throughout her life. In fact, there's a famous story about her either bat mitzvah or confirmation where she told the rabbi, I don't believe in God. And he said, stifle it for 2 hours and do the service. Then Sherwin Wine, after his death, was chosen. Baruch Spinoza was the next one. Jonas Salk, who invented the first safe polio vaccine, who was a cultural Jew. Ernestine Rose, who was an abolitionist in the 19th century and a feminist and a secularist. In fact, she drew on the Bible for her abolitionism and her feminism and her critique of religion. Richard Feynman, the physicist, who also was a secular thinker. Maurice Sendak, who again identified as a secular Jew and said so publicly. Nora Ephron, the writer. Carl Sagan, again, very explicitly a humanist and also cultural Jewish by background. Rosalind Franklin, who should have gotten credit for the discovery of DNA, and unfortunately died of ovarian cancer, most likely from the exposure to some of the X-rays that helped to make the discovery for others. Gene Wilder, another example, who says, I have no other religion. I feel very Jewish, but I don't believe in God or have anything to do with Jewish religion. He was a Jewish Buddhist atheist. So this again is seen as a role model. And then the last couple of years, Grace Paley and Amos Oz, who also passed away. Now, one of the criteria in choosing these heroes, which we did from the very beginning, was to say they have to be dead. Now, why did we say they had to be dead? 2 reasons. One is you choose a role model and then they Bill Cosby you. You know, something happens or comes out or they've been terrible all along and it's embarrassing. In theory, after they've died, whatever's going to come out's come out. It's not always true, but close enough. The second is we didn't want anyone who was a reporter to go to them and say, did you know you were chosen as the humanistic role model of the year by so-and-so? And they would say, who? What? That's crazy. Those people are ridiculous. We didn't need that either. So we wound up choosing people who can't reject it because they're gone. And we don't, use copyrighted material of theirs, so their estate can't sue us. And that's how we've gotten around the issue. But you can see how even that concept of role models has evolved over the years, where we started with just famous people whom we can claim as being secular Jews, to people who've done something with their life, like Rosalind Franklin, like Ernestine Rose, who are forces for good in the world, not just the biographical example of someone who's Jewish and secular. That's more of a happenstance. If you're choosing a role model, maybe you choose someone who's not just like you in identity, but who does things that you want to emulate in terms of ethics and behavior in the world. So I want to stop there with that. We have time for a couple more questions, and then I want to also look at a couple of the discussion questions that are part of the adult education curriculum that we've been using all year as the basis for our exploration of humanistic Jewish philosophy. So any questions, comments, reactions to that discussion on the secularized Jews, the non-Jewish Jews, and so on?
I actually had a question about the previous section. I wasn't able to get through because I couldn't figure out how to unmute my phone. But when you look at the sort of quintessential Jewish texts, the Talmud and so forth, do they ever cite outside sources in those texts, or is that sort of an insular world?
Well, they claim it's an insular world, but there are oftentimes they use Greek terms that they've just translated into Hebrew letters, or they've adapted into Hebrew usage. There are times that it seems like they may be drawing on other sources. This is a really controversial research area. In general, the sources they're quoting are Jewish sources. Sometimes they're sources we don't have elsewhere. They could be quoting the Bible, but sometimes they're also quoting other rabbinic sayings that didn't make it into the Mishnah, the early collection from around 200 BC to 200 CE. The Mishnah is collected, the first collection of rabbinic sayings. The Talmud is commentary based on that. And sometimes they quote other sayings from the same time period of the Mishnah that didn't make it in. And we don't have those outside books. We just have the Talmud's word for it. But no, it generally doesn't cite these outside sources. When you get to the Middle Ages, it gets harder to get away with that. So Maimonides will acknowledge someone he calls the philosopher in his Guide for the Perplexed. He's referring to Aristotle, albeit Aristotle mediated through Arabic translation because the Greek didn't survive, but the Arabic translation of the Greek of Aristotle, that's how the Renaissance really starts. It's from Greek to Arabic, Arabic back to Latin or Greek later on. So he cites the philosopher, or he talks about what the philosopher says in paraphrase, but he doesn't want to give him direct credit again, because there's a real controversy in Jewish thought over whether non-Jews actually have useful ideas or not. Because if you need direct divine revelation to have the truth, and only the Jews have it, then why bother learning from anybody else? The problem is when you read those outside thinkers, they have a lot of knowledge and wisdom, and it's hard to deny it. So you maybe put it in Jewish language. And so I've occasionally gotten into arguments with people who say, no, Maimonides didn't rely on Aristotle. That's impossible. And I say, any academic scholar of Maimonides knows he relied on Aristotle. It's clearly reflected in his approach. His whole concept of the middle way in life as the best ethical path and the best sort of personal development path comes directly out of Aristotle. And Aristotle wrote it centuries before Maimonides. And we know Maimonides read Aristotle in Arabic translation. But people don't want to admit that there's a citation there. So that's that idea of Jewish life in a bubble. It's hard to get people to shake, but the reality is we did draw our sources from elsewhere. Now, sometimes it was original thought too. I'm not saying that everything we do is derivative, but I want to say that our drawing on humanist philosophy to understand the world and ourselves is not unprecedented. In fact, that's also an old Jewish tradition. So I thought it'd be worth thinking about what are the benefits and challenges to using personal stories of individuals as role models for our movement. Why do we do it? Yeah, Cindy?
I think that one of the benefits is that they're fallible and relatable. As great as their examples might be, we can also look at them. If I'm not mixing him up with someone else, I seem to remember that Einstein's marital relationships weren't all that great. So we can look at him and say, okay, yeah, great. Look at all he did for education, while also not expecting that every part of his life was to be emulated so perfectly. And as somebody who, has a great marriage and kind of sucks at physics, it balances out a little bit.
Good. Hey, Becky, you were going to jump in?
I was just going to say, are you talking about personal stories of like famous people?
Yeah.
Rather than just personal stories of, let's say, from our own lives,
yeah,
or
no,
lives of
in
other
fact,
people.
I would say that using personal stories is tremendously valuable for our movement in terms of expressing why it's meaningful and important. I say to people all the time, there's no right way to explain what humanistic Judaism is and why it's meaningful. Just tell your story and why it appealed to you, and it's like testifying. But when you rely on someone like Einstein to do it, then maybe it's not as perfect. Mike has his hand up.
Yeah, and I'm not sure if this quite fits, but it's sort of on my mind. I have several friends, one of whom actually just contacted me this week, who have discovered that they have Jewish relatives, right? And this has happened frequently, and there's and I always sort of wonder whether my kinship with them was because they were actually, carrying a Jewish genetic, cultural, ethnic kind of disposition that caused us to relate to each other, even though they at the time, had no idea that they had any Jewish blood, if you will. And I find that because I think for me a certain element of Judaism is an ethnic element, I find that very sort of powerful. And I'm just curious what your experience or reaction to that might be.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because on one hand, we don't want to be like racialist, essentialist. You're one of my tribe and therefore we get along, because there are plenty of people in my tribe I don't get along with at all. I mean, there are plenty of people in my, in my extended family I might not get along with that well, let alone the extended tribe. And there are plenty of people from other tribes that we can get along with just great. You know, some of my best friends in college are non-Jews. You know, it sounds like what the anti-Semite says about Jews, right? Some of my best friends are Jews. But it's true, some of my best friends are not Jewish in college, and some of them were. And I don't know that it was anything beyond personality that made us connect. You know, there's a level of how our brains work that's beyond what we understand at the moment. And so who knows, you know, if there is a genetic piece to that, or a cultural family piece that was passed down, so they're interested in words and arguing or whatever. We don't know. Also, you know, if they had been Sephardic Jews, that cultural personality piece may be very different than Ashkenazi Jews from the same part of Europe that your family was from. And I think also this is one of the challenges in claiming famous people. On one hand, it can raise your self-esteem. You know, oh, look, Einstein's a Jew like me. You know, he's on my team. He's, you know, it's like, or he's from my hometown, a similar kind of pride raising. But at the same time, I don't know, it can be tribalist. It can be the cult of famous people. And you don't want to be chauvinistic and only talk about brilliant Jews, because there are plenty of brilliant non-Jews too. And you know, claiming that we have a monopoly or a corner of the market on this is both problematic rationally, but objectionable in terms of interethnic relations.
It's very tactful.
And someone else points out you also have to claim Bernie Madoff too.
Who's Bernie Madoff?
The guy who made off with all the money.
Yeah, the Ponzi scheme.
Right. Yeah, Larry, go ahead. Laurie, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just going to say sort of in general that I think the Bible is full of stories that teach morality. I mean, basically, I mean, that's why, you know, I think most Jews in particular don't actually think a lot of these things may have happened or these people may have lived, but it's the point of it is it justifies the social order and gives you the morality that you teach to your kids, or, you know, the way you live. And I think that as humanistic Jews, there are examples not only from the Einsteins and the Freuds, but from lots of people, like, as you say, who aren't Jewish, who have striven to make the world a better place, that we can take their role models and the morality, if you will, from that and teach that. And because, as you say, there's plenty of Jews that, I mean, I only have to think about Kushner in the White House or Miller, you know, I mean, these are horrible people, you know, I wouldn't want them to be role models in any way responsibly, you know. So at the same time, there are non-Jews that are perfectly good role models. And so we have to search around for the experiences that are significant to us in terms of the way that we think about life.
Right. Well, and, you know, sometimes we have to define people by what they do and not necessarily who they are. But it may be the case that you find more effective role models from people who are both who you are and are doing what you want to do. You know, if you get both, then maybe it's a plus. And I had this discussion with Sherwin Wine when I was in rabbinical school 20 years ago. You know, let's say we have two poems, and if you did the terrible thing they do in Dead Poets Society, and you create a scale and you rated the poem on a scale of 1 to 100, and let's say both poems tied at an 89, and one is by a Jewish author and one is by a non-Jewish author, which one would you pick to put in your service that you're creating? And maybe you give the Jewish author one more point because of the ethnic, cultural roots connection, that it makes you feel good. You know, I can read in Chinese philosophy all kinds of wonderful ethical maxims, but when I read in my people's book of ethical ideas that you should not oppress a worker by withholding his wages, but you should pay them at the same time and not put them in kind of a wage slavery, I love that my people said that in a way that's maybe blatantly chauvinistic, but it's at least drawing, you know, some pride from that heritage. But I'm also willing to admit the skeletons in my closet, the Madoffs and the Kushners and the, you know, the Noah flood story and other things that we might find really objectionable. So let me ask you this next question, which is number 4 on the list. Why is it important to secular humanistic Jews to maintain a positive Jewish identity rather than simply joining the general world of non-ethnic humanism? After all, there's a lot of general humanist organizations out there. There's the Council for Secular Humanism. There's the Freedom from Religion Foundation. There's American Atheists. There's the American Humanist Association. There's the International Humanist and Ethical Union. There's all kinds of ways that you can be an ethical humanist without being Jewish. And yet we've insisted on maintaining some kind of positive Jewish identity. So
Rabbi?
why do we do that? Yeah, Rich.
It's important to me personally to have a Jewish identity, because otherwise I wouldn't be there. And for the sake of the movement, I think it's important that it have a very specific identity, secular and Jewish. If you take out one of those, yes, they'll belong elsewhere. It's to my preference that our movement exist and grow and thrive. And if we didn't have both aspects, I don't think that'll happen. So from a personal point of view, it doesn't matter. But I want people to belong to us so this movement can survive. And I say you need both aspects for that to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
Well, I think this actually, to build on sort of what Richard's saying, I mean, this was what I was just talking about, which is that we have a cultural and ethnic identity that is, has nothing to do with the religion. So if we make it all about the religion, make it all about being secular, then we lose what it's about being Jewish that has nothing to do with religion, which I think is a pretty big portion of what we're about.
Mm-hmm. I think there are pragmatic reasons why it makes sense for us to maintain a Jewish identity. First of all, many of us are Jewish. We come from a Jewish background or have married someone who comes from a Jewish background. And I think that having a positive connection to your personal family roots is important to being a happy and satisfied and comfortable individual. Having family trauma in the background and having a disconnect from that past can be a challenge, and having a way to relate positively, authentically is valuable. And having an ethnic identity doesn't have to be parochial or limiting. You can feel like being Jewish is good without being the best or better than everybody else. You don't have to be a chauvinist to have pride in who you are. I can root for my team. I don't have to be a jerk to all the other teams. You can be a good fan and a good sport. I'd like my children to think that they're good students. I don't need them to say I'm the best student in every class. That's not either reasonable or a way to make friends and influence people. And to some extent, if I were just human, part of a universal humanity, it's almost too large to be part of something like that. You get lost, it's like being on a campus of 50,000 students and not joining a club or an activity and just being out there in the mass of people. And we are allowed to have that distinct identity, as most parts of humanity divides itself by ethnic group, heritage, culture, national identity, and so on. And finally, we also get real meaning out of that Jewish experience. That's different from a New Year's Day on January 1st or Solstice Day on June 21st, having Hanukkah, having Passover. That gives us a sense of cultural richness and depth and emotional connection that you just can't get from substitutes. Mike, you had your hand up again?
Yeah, well, I think I completely agree with that, and that's a great explanation of it. But I know for me personally, and as a function of our age, there's unfortunately a negative aspect to it, which is, I can call myself Jewish or not, but in recent history, it doesn't really matter what I call myself, because others are going to consider me Jewish, regardless of how I self-identify, and that will have potentially life and death consequences. Yes.
We try not to rely on that as a positive motivation. Hitler would kill you, therefore be Jewish. That only goes so far. But that is part of the process of choosing identity. Sometimes you don't have absolute choice to keep or leave behind. And the last reason why I'm easily able to defend myself when the universal secularist says, "Why are you still Jewish?" And half the time they were born Jewish and left it behind, which they're welcome to do. But I'll say to them, having a particular perspective doesn't mean I can't have broad perspective too. I come from a particularly rooted position in my people's culture, language, history, holidays, and so on. That helps me understand other people's particularly rooted culture, language, history, holidays, life cycle events, and so we have a coming of age ceremony. They have a coming of age ceremony. We have a winter solstice event. They have a winter solstice event. So I can find the parallels from my experience if I'm open to learning about their experience, because all of religion, all of culture is a response to the human experience. We're born, we live a limited lifetime, we die, we miss people, we notice the seasons change, we fall in love. I mean, these are things that happen in every culture, and each religion is responding to those realities in a different vocabulary. I like to think of it using a metaphor that I read about recently that Amos Oz wrote, but also I've heard Yehuda Bauer say as well, that the Jewish people are like a piccolo in the human orchestra, a very small instrument. And if we play our instrument too loud as if we're the only instrument, then it's not going to work. It's not going to make harmony. And if, on the other hand, we never played the piccolo and let it go, there would be no piccolo. There would be something lost in the world of human music. But if we play our part appropriately in harmony with other distinct peoples, woodwinds and string instruments and percussion, then we can make a beautiful human chorus. But if it's all trumpets all the time, well, that gets old. It's okay to have diversity as long as they work together. I love fusion cuisine. I love going to a restaurant district that has varieties of restaurants. I don't want Applebee's. That would be boring. So I see Jewish culture as one of those varieties, and we find it important to maintain our version of that human experience to preserve it in the world.